Hello everyone, so this video is going to be about anaerobic and aerobic respiration. I know everyone's done their lab on the yeast, which involved alcohol fermentation, so we'll talk more about that, as well as a different type of fermentation called lactic acid fermentation. The key objectives of this presentation are to review the two types of anaerobic respiration, to explain the specific steps involved in lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation, and to compare and contrast anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So in your last two videos, you saw that aerobic respiration is basically normal cellular respiration, and it has three steps: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. And at each point of these steps, energy, ATP, is formed, but this process requires oxygen. So it requires oxygen before it goes into the mitochondria. So oxygen needs to be present before this process of the Krebs cycle will occur. If oxygen is not present, then what happens? Do we just stop making ATP? Well, the answer is no. We don't just stop making ATP, because glycolysis, the first step of regular cellular respiration, doesn't require oxygen. So that's actually very useful. So just a recap of glycolysis: we start off with glucose and we end up producing 2-pyruvate. And in the process we make 2 ATP, and we remember that NAD plus is actually taking electrons from the pyruvate and becoming NADH, which is an electron carrier, so it's carrying energy. However, once all the NADH are all filled up with electrons, you can't really do anything in this process anymore. You can't make any more ATP because there's no more NAD plus to kind of pick up energy from the pyruvate electrons. Basically what happens now is the cell will either undergo cellular respiration depending on if there's oxygen or not. So if there's oxygen, the cell will continue to go towards the mitochondria, and the pyruvate will be converted into acetyl-CoA, and the rest of cellular respiration will occur. If not, something else happens. So depending on the type of cells, two things can happen. So there's two types of anaerobic respiration. The first one is alcohol fermentation, so that's what you saw in your yeast. And the second one is lactic acid fermentation. Both of these processes utilize glycolysis, and they do that because glycolysis doesn't use any oxygen. So this just basically allows the cell to undergo ATP production without any oxygen present. And it doesn't really make a lot of ATP, so it makes very, very little in comparison to aerobic respiration, so respiration with oxygen. It only makes 2 ATP molecules per glucose, which is not a lot compared to regular aerobic respiration that makes 32 to 38 per glucose. Very big difference, but hey, I guess it's better than dying, right? So the first one we'll talk about is lactic acid fermentation. And what happens in this process is basically pyruvate is converted into a new molecule, a molecule called lactic acid. So if we remember, this is just basically showing normal glycolysis, but in lactic acid formation, pyruvate is converted into 2 lactic acid molecules. And how that's converted is the NADH actually transports electrons to this lactic acid. And because of that, NADH now becomes NAD+. And now that we have freed NAD+, that can go back and produce more ATP through glycolysis. So now that we have this more NAD+, we can make more ATP through glycolysis. So glycolysis can keep going again and again, producing its measly 2 ATP. But again, it's better than nothing. And lactic acid fermentation is actually really interesting. So it mostly occurs in animals, but specifically in humans. Have you guys ever, when you exercise too much or too fast, your muscles really start to burn and it hurts really bad, and then you have to stop working out or exercising? Well, that's actually because the lactic acid kind of builds up in your muscles, and that's what's causing it to burn, is that acid buildup. So really interesting stuff. So next time you're in the gym, tell someone why their muscles are burning. It's because of the buildup in lactic acid from fermentation. And this basically happens because when you're working out too fast or too long, your body kind of runs out of oxygen. So in order to get the muscles the oxygen it needs, it undergoes fermentation until your body can kind of catch up and produce ATP through cellular respiration. So the next type of fermentation you already know is alcohol fermentation. So instead, in this process, pyruvate is converted into ethyl alcohol. That's why it's called alcohol fermentation. So basically in this process, the NADH gives its electrons to the ethyl alcohol, and that frees up the NAD plus to undergo glycolysis again and again and again. But something else happens. So this ethyl alcohol has one less carbon than pyruvate does. So that carbon basically is then met with some oxygen and it produces a byproduct of CO2. So that's why in your yeast experiment that balloon blew up. It was filling up with carbon dioxide and that byproduct from this reaction. And alcohol fermentation is actually really useful. So it's commonly used to make wine, beer, and even bread. So it's used to make bread because it helps the bread rise. That CO2 comes in and it helps that bread kind of rise, as you could see here. And it's useful for producing wine and beer because another byproduct of this is alcohol. So that's why it's used for producing wine and beer. So now we're just going to talk about the similarities and differences between the two processes. So anaerobic and aerobic respiration both use glycolysis to produce ATP. However, aerobic respiration continues processing further during the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to produce more ATP. Anaerobic respiration is not as efficient and it only produces 2 ATP per glucose, whereas aerobic respiration produces 32 to 38 ATP per glucose molecule. And as we know, anaerobic respiration doesn't require any oxygen, whereas aerobic respiration requires oxygen. So the key points of this presentation is that anaerobic respiration can be used when oxygen isn't available to allow the production of ATP. So this is an advantage for organisms because when they're in a situation where there's no oxygen around, they can still kind of survive until they get oxygen and make ATP needed for them to survive. Anaerobic respiration obviously isn't as efficient as regular aerobic respiration, but it helps enough until the organism can get in the area where there's oxygen. And finally, anaerobic respiration is really important and has many commercial applications. It's used to make beer, it's used to make wine, it's used to make bread, and it's even used to make yogurt. So I hope you guys learned something today. Bye.